We are operating in Rafah in a very targeted and precise way.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today calling it a tragic mishap.
We seek to go after Hamas and limit civilian casualties.
But you don't know how many civilians you're killing.
Our war is against Hamas, not against the people of Gaza.
The war is not just with Hamas. The war is with all the civilians.
We're not targeting civilians. We're targeting Hamas. But
Israel's use of overwhelming and often indiscriminate force in areas where civilians are sheltering.
The IDF claimed in a tweet in late October that the Al-Shifa hospital was the main headquarters for Hamas terrorist activity.
They are still searching at this hour for the tunnels that they say are beneath the hospital.
In this room, he says, a guard list that begins October 7th.
Now, this claim spread like wildfire.
Every terrorist writes his name.
But there are no Hamas agents' names on this sheet whatsoever. In fact, there are no names at all. The only text here that's here in Arabic, the only names here are in fact the days of the week.
Yet another episode of The Stream brought to you in the midst of one of the darkest chapters in our collective history. Civilian safe zones are bombed, schools and hospitals targeted, humanitarian workers and journalists killed on a daily basis in the Gaza Strip. And yet many people continue to dispute facts and actually believe Israel's line of self-defense. How? Well, at least in part, thanks to a carefully crafted tool to shape public opinion and influence geopolitics. I'm Anelise Borges, and in today's show, we will shed light on Israel's sophisticated comms technique, Hasbara. And for that, we will count on the help of novelist, trauma therapist, and PhD student Katie Bogen, joining us from Connecticut, writer, podcaster, and stand-up comedian Matt Lieb, joining us from Los Angeles, and Jennine Khalik, a Palestinian Australian journalist and researcher based in Sydney. Thank you all so much for joining us here on The Stream today. It's a pleasure to have you. Jennine, let me start with you. Can you elaborate on the definition of Hasbara for our viewers here, but also what's the story behind the term? Where did it come from and how did it become so important?
Yeah, so Hasbara essentially means, it roughly translates into the word explanation in Hebrew. So it's used to explain sort of anything about the Israeli state's sort of mythology of itself and how it came to be and why it needed to be created. And it's also used to explain their behavior and to explain their ongoing, settler colonial existence. So the term was first officially coined in 1912 by someone who later became a member of the World Zionist Congress, with the president, in fact. And that obviously preceded the establishment of the State of Israel. But it was until many decades later that Hasbara was adopted as a strategy, as a policy, like named in such a way. And we've been seeing that for the past 50 years.
It is a fascinating technique if it wasn't so damaging and so painful to see what the crimes that it has covered. Katie, your family has a very painful history. Your grandparents survived the Holocaust and you grew up hearing these apparently benign elements of narrative, a land without people for people without a land, a desert that needs blooming. When did you start questioning these elements of narrative?
So I grew up, I think, hearing the mythology that so many Jewish youth around the world hear about the state of Israel. I heard, that this was a land without a people for a people without a land, that this was a land promised to the Jewish people. And I did not hear the word Palestine or understand Palestinians as a community until I was about 17 years old and went to college. And I think a big part of Hasbara is this silencing. It's really what is not said or what is not shared as much as what is demonstrated. And I think the process of instilling cognitive dissonance as a part of being Jewish begins very young. I mean, we're taught that occupied Palestine was essentially an empty desert before the Jews got there. So imagine the confusion then for someone in a political science class in college, seeing an image of a bustling Palestinian city in 1915 or 1920. You start to have this itch or this bafflement of, this is the opposite of what I was taught growing up. Another example might be, Israel is the only safe space for Jews. You're hearing this over and over and over again as you grow up, while you yourself may be living in relative safety. And you're also getting the message of Israel is so unsafe that the occupation force has to use whatever means necessary to defend this state. And so over and over again, you experience this cognitive dissonance and tension of what it means to be Zionist versus what it means to be Jewish. And it establishes a norm of allowing cognitive dissonance to exist without interrogating it, without questioning it. And that, I think, undergirds the strength of some of this Hasbara. And so part of the process of unlearning Zionism for Jewish youth right now, and Jewish people sort of all ages and all over the world, is leaning into the cognitive dissonance and actually beginning to parse it.
Matt, what about you? You also grew up in a Jewish family, but you said your family was not religious as such. It was more of a secular type of relationship with this narrative. Yeah. What made you question this narrative? What was the moment you, woke up to another history?
It was slow going for me. So I grew up in a secular mixed family. So intermarriage. So that was not something that was a big deal to me growing up. The fact that you could, be from a household with, two different ethnicities, two different religions, and even without the religion, Zionism seemed to supplant that. So even without being a religious family or a religious person personally, Israel was always the place we were told was going to be our plan B. That's where we're going to go when eventually the Nazis come back to power and we need a place to go. So I kind of just took it for granted that we had this corner of the world carved out specifically for us. And it wasn't until first, college, but then birthright. I went on a birthright trip because I, was like, hey, I like free things. It's free. Let's do it. And,
we all do.
And yeah, and it was eye-opening for me, but not in the way that they wanted it to be. It was clear that it was essentially a real hard sales pitch for us to go there and eventually to move there, to be so in love with this land that was specifically made for us, that we would, uproot our lives and go to Israel and make Jewish babies. And when I went there, I had the experience that I think a lot of people I've known have had, which is you see how hard they are pushing you to separate you from the place that you're actually from. Like for me, it's Los Angeles. That's my homeland. And, diaspora Jews around the world, their homeland is wherever they are. And it was such a hard sales pitch. And not only was it this all expenses paid vacation, but also Benjamin Netanyahu personally came out and to this giant birthright event and told us, welcome home, and told us that we should move there. And if not move there, we should, for sure to make Jewish babies. But if we weren't going to move there, he said he needed us to go back home and tell people the truth about Israel. Tell them what you saw here. And then he proceeded to tell us what we saw there. And it was just clearly he wanted to deputize us as Hasbara agents. And that's kind of when I felt like I was doing a lot of heavy lifting for the state of Israel for free for many years. And I decided that this was probably not what it seems.
We're obviously talking about these things in a light manner, but Jennine, for you, you experienced the other side. Your family and friends have suffered immensely because of this silencing, as Katie made the reference earlier. Can you tell us a little bit more about when you woke up to the fact that there was a parallel reality being told to the world, being sold to the world, a reality that was nothing, that had nothing to do with the reality of your family and your friends?
Yeah, I would say I was quite young when, you know, we had Al Jazeera on at home, and I remember seeing like footage of the second Intifada, and I was about 7 or 8, and you know, not really obviously having a sort of political consciousness, but knowing that these were our people and this was how they were being affected. And I grew up with that, but I would say it wasn't until sort of later on in high school, and then when I started university and also started working at local newspapers. So I was a journalist for a while, and I worked at the national broadcaster and Australia's only national newspaper. And, you know, I had a horrible experience. You know, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, when I was 21 years old, working at the Australian, which is the only national paper and is a rag, sent over 2 members of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which is what the public diplomacy department falls under and sits under as well. So they sent 2 of their diplomats to Australia, and they had a meeting with 2 of my editors at this paper, asking them why they had hired a Palestinian. You know, it's quite interesting that you've hired a Palestinian.
Wow.
And I was 21 years old. And I think this is when
they flew all the way to Australia because of you?
Yeah, I mean, like a Palestinian journalist or a Palestinian in general, sort of having access to these spaces is a real threat. I think it's quite preventative, right? And me being this very stubborn Palestinian that I am, you know, persevered to, it was awful for many reasons. I had colleagues, you know, put a dossier on me because, you know, some of the Zionist lobby groups as well, quite close to some of the reporters and editors. And this is something that they do. They invite reporters and editors, for example, to go on propaganda trips to historic Palestine.
The pressure is real. And I think what is very important, because we're going through your personal experiences here, each one of you, but it's also very important to kind of highlight how this is absolutely not some oral tradition that people have repeated over the years and then convinced themselves of. This is structured and is supported and financed by the highest instances of power in Israel. Yes, there is even a government office dedicated solely to Hasbara. Take a look.
Back in 2015, Gideon Levy would write a scathing article in the Israeli Haaretz saying, quote, "The policy of denial and disconnection from reality is rising to a dangerous level, and the illness is getting worse. Israel further entrenches itself in its imaginary reality." The so-called Hasbara apparatus underwent a massive overhaul, which included the creation of a government office dedicated solely to Hasbara, the National Hasbara Headquarters within the Office of the Prime Minister. Its many arms extend to the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs, the Ministry of Tourism, the Jewish Agency for Israel, and notably the IDF Spokespersons Division, the propaganda arm of the Israeli military, tasked with operating the IDF's official website and blog, YouTube channel, Twitter, and other social media accounts.
Katie, since October 7th, things have become much more in our face, and yet many people still find it in them to argue that, I don't know, the bombing of schools and hospitals, the starvation of civilians, that's all part of self-defense. You are a trained psychologist. Can you walk us through some of the concepts and the techniques of Hasbara, especially the manipulation techniques?
So the just world hypothesis is this mythology that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And we see this in constructs like heaven and hell, of if you're a good person, you'll go to heaven. If you're a bad person, you'll go to hell. If you're a good kid, you'll get gifts on Christmas. If you're a bad kid, you'll get coal. And therefore, if something horrible happens to a group of people, we integrate that into our theory of the just world myth of they must have done something to deserve this. They must be bad people. They're being punished for something. We see this with survivors of trauma all the time who think, I must be such a horrible person for this to have happened to me. And we're seeing this operate on 2 levels, where Israeli folks are not suffering right now the way that Palestinian folks are suffering. They're not being bombarded right now the way that Palestinian folks are being bombarded. And they get to tell themselves, this is because we're the better team. This is because we're good people, that fewer of us are dying. Whereas Palestinians are experiencing the opposite, and the world is observing the opposite. That's the way that the just world hypothesis really functions.
Matt, you actually started a podcast, and I believe post October 7th. Can you talk a little bit about how the idea came about and what you talk about in your podcast?
Sure. Yeah, I started a podcast in December 2023 called Bad Hasbara, the world's most moral podcast. And I started it because I noticed that for the first time in my lifetime, Hasbara had stopped being good. Essentially, for years and years growing up, there was always a way to kind of explain away any sort of illegal action or brutal action that the Israeli government took. And not that you can, easily explain any of these war crimes, but it was something that for a Western liberal audience, you could essentially convince them that, okay, maybe Israel has a good reason to, bomb a hospital. I mean, they say it was a Hamas stronghold, so possibly they're not lying. After October 7th, I noticed that because of the sheer scale of the actions in Gaza that the IDF was taking, they would lie, and then they would have to tell a half-truth and then another half-truth and then admit the war crime, but say we had to do it, all within a span of 24 hours. So you remember, I think it was the Al-Shifa hospital. It was bombed. They said, we didn't bomb a hospital. Of course we didn't bomb a hospital. We would never bomb a hospital. We're the good guys. And then, a few hours later, it was like, okay, so we did bomb the hospital, but we had to bomb the hospital. And it just very quickly became clear that they were not going to be able to juggle all of the lies that they tell as kind of cleanly as they have been doing in the past. So I just got to a point where I had had enough conversations with friends of mine that I had known for years and years who were completely normal before October 7th. I had enough conversations with them where it was clear that they were buying into this total BS propaganda that I just couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't keep having the same conversation with people over and over and over again. Like when you're having a conversation with your, friends that you've known forever about why it is still immoral to starve children, it gets a little bit emotionally draining. So I decided that I needed to try to break down some of this classic Hasbara that we've been, programmed to believe since birth for a lot of us. And it's a comedy podcast, which I understand is hard to do within this subject.
Jennine, your take here, because you also took upon yourself to do something very important, to set the record straight, to kind of monitor the discussion and the conversation and the media coverage that was happening. You created something called the Hasbara Tracker. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Hasbara Tracker is a website/database where we are essentially collecting the claims that the Israeli state has made, particularly since October 7th, because there has been so much more, and debunking these claims very methodically, unpacking them chronologically at this moment, and providing much needed context and claims within subclaims, within the claims, and locating the original sources of the claims, like where did this information originally come from? Was it from an IOF press release? Was it from a comment by the IOF to a particular media outlet? Was it a tweet? And so it's been an exercise in recording, documenting, and archiving. And even though this in and of itself is not stopping the horrors that we're seeing in Gaza, I think it's still important for posterity and also for us to actually locate some of these patterns and have this centralized in a repository somewhere.
It sounds like a very interesting tool for journalists as well. Are you getting feedback in terms of people asking you for help to locate an information and to debunk something?
Yeah, and vice versa as well. There's a lot of crowdsourcing happening. Over 1,000 people have signed up to volunteer with different skills, talent, expertise, and there's some assigning a claim to a certain person who might be in a better position to work on and unpack a claim, and also taking into consideration their capacity. But I also wanted to say, I mean, if you've been paying attention long enough, or as a Palestinian, it's really quite different. But Israeli Hasbara has never been good. Actually, I mean, a lot of the retracting and the diluting has happened since time immemorial. So it's a pattern that with Muhammad Dura, who was killed in Gaza many years ago, they are basically using the same playbook, and they are just using the same playbook right now, but we're just seeing it more.
And one of the reasons I would say, sorry to interrupt you, Jennine, but one of the reasons I would say that we are seeing this much more is also perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, because of social media, right? Because there's so much more information available out there. Are you, Jennine, also, I don't know, using your Hasbara tracker on social media?
Absolutely. Again, trying to locate primary sources from Palestinians also on the ground, also locating what some IOF soldiers have been posting. But that also really depends on, especially in terms of documenting, I mean, Palestinians in Gaza have been documenting their own genocide and have been telling us. So really using, that footage or those testimonies as well to help contextualize and debunk these claims.
Do you think we are witnessing here a watershed moment? Will there be a before and after October 7th? Will we finally be able to, I don't know, bury these Hasbara techniques and move on to another period that perhaps we all face the truth about what's really going on in this region? Katie, your take.
I would love to be optimistic. I would love to think that the labor that folks are doing to unveil Hasbara and really provide alternatives is going to be strong enough to fight against those cognitive norms that are established. So I will say, I hope so.
Matt, your take?
Yeah, I agree. I am cautiously optimistic. I'd like to believe that people are now getting to the point where they can't, in good conscience, hold up these lies and hold water for the Israeli government. So my hope is that, that people will finally start to see through the Hasbara and stop supporting a state just because the American government tells them to.
Jennine, final word from you. Are you hopeful that things will finally change and that more Palestinian voices will be heard?
Yeah, I mean, I do hope so. I think in terms of, say, Hasbara, unfortunately, even though people are seeing through it and waking up, again, it's not materially stopping the bombs. There seems to be no red line whatsoever. Even public relations, the Israeli state just does not care. But I do have hope, putting Hasbara aside, because Hasbara is the Israeli state. So I do have hope that Palestine will be liberated and that we will get to return. I have to have that hope and that optimism and not allow my spirit to be crushed. And I think that's the one thing that they can't take away from us.
Thank you so much, Jennine, Matt, and Katie, for joining us here on the stream today. It's been great having you guys part of this conversation. And thank you all for watching Stay in touch with us on social media. If you have a conversation or a topic that you'd like to flag for us, you can use the hashtag or the handle AJStream, and we'll look into your suggestions. Take care, and I'll see you soon.